Welcome to Kids Health Revolution Radio with Deborah Morgan. On our show, we'll discuss natural and alternative health approaches to help children who have chronic health concerns. You'll hear from professional health experts and fellow parents who have used these proven methods to improve the health of their children, and you can too. If you have questions or topics you would like covered on the show, please send an email to Deborah@kidshealthrevolution.com. And now, here's Deborah.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Kids Health Revolution Radio. It is Deborah Morgan coming to you with another episode of inspiration, information, and of course the tools that you need as parents to start taking action and improving your child's health. So today on the show, we are talking to two authors of a fabulous new book that I've been very lucky to receive the galley copy of, and I've read quite thoroughly. I really enjoyed this book. I'm so happy that they've gotten together and written this. It's going to be huge for parents, as well as I think for our medical system. So today I'm talking to Dr. Michelle Perro and Dr. Vincanne Adams, and they've written the book called What's Making Our Children Sick. And this is a very important topic to anybody who listens to my program. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about what the book's about, and then I'm going to introduce the authors, and we're going to chat with them and have them answer some questions that are on my mind after having read the book. So there's just a really brief little description about the book. It's called, again, What's Making Our Children Sick. It's a radical rethinking of the relationship between our children's food, medicine, and health in the 21st century. Michelle Perro, MD and veteran pediatrician, over 35 years experience successfully treating children, and Vincanne Adams, PhD from the University of California, both provide a clinical and scientifically sound explanation of the pediatric health crisis the agrochemical industry has helped to create, and present a food-focused, go-to resource for parents, practitioners, and health educators to follow. This book explores the links between GM foods, pesticides like glyphosate, and the emerging science around our gut health. We talk a lot about that on the show, as you know, and offers a path forward to help heal our kids and reverse the compromised health of our food supply. So I love that. It's all about what we're talking about on the show all the time, that we do as parents have this amazing power to help our children, to heal our kids, and help reverse some of these chronic health conditions that we're seeing. And something as simple as the food that we put on our table every day can make an immense difference. So our authors today and experts, Michelle Perro is, as I said, a veteran pediatrician with over 35 years of experience in acute and integrative medicine. She has both directed and worked as an attending physician from New York's Metropolitan Hospital to UCF's I'm not sure how to say that, Benioff Children's Hospital in Oakland. She is currently lecturing and consulting and working with Gordon Medical Associates, an integrative health center in Northern California. And then we also have Vincanne Adams, who is PhD, a professor and vice chair of medical anthropology at the University of California, San Francisco. She has previously published 6 books on the social dynamics of health, scientific knowledge, and politics, and is currently the editor for Medical Anthropology Quarterly. So thank you both for joining me on the show today.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for having us.
Yes, great to be here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Deborah, I think Rebecca was your previous interview.
Oh, pardon me, Deborah.
That's
I've got
okay.
Rebecca on my mind.
Yeah.
Forgive.
Not a
Hello.
problem. I totally forgive. I know how it is. You're doing lots of interviews and you talk to lots of people, so no problem. Not a problem at all. So you guys have embarked on this adventure of writing this fairly revolutionary book, I would venture to say. And I'd love to hear a little bit about the story of what prompted you guys to write such a book.
Okay, well, I can jump in. And how I got started on this journey, Deborah, it was not my training or my background. As you already mentioned, my experience is in acute care pediatrics and pediatric emergency medicine and urgent care. And there were some simultaneous events that had occurred in my own life, beginning with my son's own health and health challenges 23, 24 years ago. Mm-hmm. And through my experience with traditional medicine and coming up with dead ends for my own child, I learned about homeopathic treatment. This was even before I knew anything about integrative health. And I became a homeopath, studying at night. My kids were small. I had a full-time practice. And those were some crazy days. But, concurrently with that, I got involved with a women's, mostly women, do we have any guys? Maybe one, movement to stop the spray of pesticides along Northern California's coast. And I was solicited not because of my great skill in pesticides or food understanding, because I had none at the time, was because they just needed an MD on their board. And through these pesky moms who got me in there, my whole life literally flipped upside down when I learned about genetically modified food through one of the moms, insisted I read Seeds of Deception by Jeffrey Smith.
Right.
And being a good pediatrician, when women speak and when they're moms, I listened, I read, and I was horrified. And I thought, oh my God, could what I started to read in his book, talking about certain researchers, which we can get into. I always talk about Dr. Arpad Pusti. He is my hero and my role model. That I realized that with the light bulbs popping in my head, that these acute on chronic diseases I was seeing in children were related to GM foods and pesticides, and I knew I needed to do more research. We're totally pro-science, and Vincanne and I worked very hard to get that through in the book, and I started to dig into the studies.
Awesome. And so, Vincanne, can you tell us a little bit about how you got on this path, and then maybe a little bit about, if you guys can maybe mention, what brought you together? Were you friends previously? How did you come together to embark on this book?
Right. Well, thanks for asking. And I have to start by saying, any academic who jumps into the world of GMO foods does so with a huge amount of trepidation.
Oh yeah, both of you are very brave.
I met Michelle because she's my neighbor, and I started walking with her and talking with her, and she was telling me about this amazing world that she lived in where, she was treating kids who had these chronic disorders. And not only did that resonate with my own experience, I had at least one kid who had been through some of those chronic health disorders. But I also was hearing her talk about, the kind of integrative medicine she was practicing. And, I also was getting exposed to a lot of others of my own students who were dealing with chronic disorders and feeling like there's this rising tide and overwhelming sense of people not getting the kind of help they need. And so I was really intrigued by Michelle's practice. And I thought, wow, this is another, I've been teaching about and being critical of the medical model for many years, but this is a great story. She has got a great story. The kind of integrative medicine that she's practicing is worth writing about in its own right. Now, when she talked about GM foods, I have to say I was really skeptical at first. Like a lot of people, I just went to the websites and I started reading about it, and it's very controversial.
Yes.
And I started realizing when I dug a little deeper and I started reading over her shoulder and I started listening more carefully to what she was talking about and realizing that she had a theory about how to connect the dots between the food being contaminated and the health of the kid falling apart, that I just said, wow, this is really, really interesting as well. And even the politics of the science here are really interesting. And this is right up my alley. I mean, I've been writing on this for years. And so I thought to myself, God, I'd like to write a book about her. And in part, the book is a book about Michelle. But I found out she had been wanting to write a book for many years. And of course, being a clinician, she didn't have time.
Right.
And so I said, well, okay, we talked about it and we decided let's do this together. We'll bring the clinical experience that Michelle has. She was gracious and let me into her world. I interviewed patients with her. I sat in on her clinical hours and watched her in practice and took note of what she was doing. And, and then we really, she pointed me to a lot of the literature and the science, and I got to interview some other scientists, and it's just been a great collaboration, I have to say, with, both fields of expertise coming into play.
Perfect. It's a great combination to have in a book like this, and especially to present it with that scientific rigor, because there is so much information out there about GMOs, both pro and con, and it's sometimes difficult to know as the lay person if what you're reading is really scientifically sound. So that's one of the things I love about your book, and having you on to talk today, is that I can know that I'm talking to two people who are very experienced and aren't just providing me with fluff information here, right?
We are anti-fluff, Deborah. We get into the weeds, as Vincanne likes to say, and really present ourselves, because we are so heavily scrutinized, as you can imagine, by the other people in this field who are, pro-GMO, although I don't want to create it as a for and against, but there are kind of camps in this area. Absolutely. That we had to be squeaky clean. And we have so many citations in the book where we really dug deep, and we tossed out a lot of articles that we didn't find met the rigor that we were trying to achieve. So I think, it is our best foot forward that we want to present a book that is not only good for parents and educators, but for academics. And hopefully Vincanne will use it when she teaches her medical students and students at UCSF, her graduate students. So that was part of the hope when we wrote this book.
Beautiful. I love that. And I love the idea that this could be used when educating, our future doctors, if they could start out with this sort of eye-opening knowledge rather than having to come by it later on because of personal experience. Wouldn't that be something fabulous?
And, we talk about this too, Deborah, that, so many moms in particular, but parents have become their own educators.
Yes. And
that they're not seeking this, they're not receiving, they're seeking for sure, not receiving the support they require to get their kids healthy, which is a doable task. This is not doable. Kids get better. So to create a system, and we're kind of jumping to the end, we can talk about this later, but is to create a system that can guide, help, support them. It's totally available and doable. So there will be need. We will require this shift in the paradigm of how we do business, because having parents out there journey this themselves is awful. I know it's your story. It's the story of many of the moms. And frankly, I often feel like we owe the moms out there an apology to have this on their own.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And, it's a struggle. I can say that from personal experience. But I'd like to think, at the same time that we as these moms who are out there doing this are part of the movement, or in helping flip, make the switch to this new paradigm. Does that feel right to you?
Well, I was going to say, I think what we were trying to do in the book is put enough of connect enough of the dots for both parents and other clinicians, and possibly even for medical educators. That would be lovely. Between the kinds of foods that we're eating now and the kinds of chronic health disorders we have. And as Michelle said, we really worked hard to get the science right in the book. Mm-hmm. We also consulted other scientists who are working on this. I am not a biomedical scientist. Michelle is a clinician. Mm-hmm. But we did want to make a book that would make it clear that we have enough to go on to start connecting the dots. And we see it, I like to think of it as an opening, maybe levering open some of those communities that are still reluctant or not committed to looking at this more seriously. Mm-hmm. So the hope is that, we have enough information about medical syndromes that are happening, the microbiome, the way food affects the microbiome, the changes in our food system over the last 20 years, and these chronic disorders. And hopefully those connections, there's enough information in the book to connect those dots in ways that will, spawn and spur more research in this area, because that's what we need.
That is what we need, yes. More research and more people doing the work to make the small changes that we can make at home, and documenting our experience for sure. So let's talk a little bit about the chronic childhood illnesses, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but we've got, a huge rise in these illnesses. And so I'd love to hear from you, what types of diseases and disorders are you seeing on the rise, and what kind of rise are we talking about?
The palette of chronic issues in children is broad, rapidly changing, and epidemic in proportion. They cover every part of childhood illnesses, from things as common as recurrent infections in kids who can't get better, to more serious things such as atopic diseases, which include eczema, asthma, and environmental, as well as food allergies. Food allergies in themselves are up 40%. Endocrine disorders, from everything from obesity, which is now affecting 1 in 5 children, to type 2 diabetes, to particularly thyroid dysfunction. Hypothyroidism is a massive problem, later leading to autoimmune disease, which is significantly rising in children. I've had boys as young as 8 with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, an autoimmune thyroid condition, which is unheard of. If you add in neurocognitive disorders such as autistic spectrum disorder, which is now affecting 1 in 68 kids, 1 in 43 boys, and rising here in the U.S. I think in Canada you have similar statistics, by the way, because I looked.
Yes.
Which is profound, including other learning challenges such as ADHD, and don't exclude mental health disorders, which also are rising exponentially, such as anxiety, OCD, bipolar disease, depression, eating disorders. And if I want to just top off the cake with things that we call in pediatrics dysomnias, which are sleeping disorders, are now affecting 2 of 3 children under the age of 10, where kids don't sleep well. And as you know, as a parent, when your child is not sleeping well, the whole family goes downhill. Talk about an impetus for change is get a kid not sleeping, that family will be knocking at your door.
Oh, yeah.
So, and this doesn't even include everything. So, but I think your listener will get an idea like, wow, this is pretty large, the amount of disorders and changes we're seeing in health. You said I've been doing this for almost 4 decades. I've noticed the worst change within the past 15 to 20 years.
Is that right? Interesting. So, it's important, I think, for parents to get an idea of the scope of it, because if you're listening and you have a child that has eczema, or you have a child that has ADHD, or maybe your child struggles with anxiety, you're sort of in this world of just seeing what your child's going through, but understanding that there's this huge scope of increase, and it's not just one disorder, but it's all of these different things that we're seeing on the rise. Is that correct?
That is correct, and they're all linked. So in Western medicine, we're trained to think of things as systems, like a lung issue, a kidney issue. It's a brain issue, as if you're cut off from your neck. Mm-hmm. The integrative holistic viewpoint is that we're a systems biology. We also call it functional medicine, where we're related as a whole. And much of the health issues stem from the gut. But when you treat a patient, a kid, a family member, what we try to do is restore the body's innate ability to heal itself. And Vincanne and I spent a significant part of this book really jumping into the gut disorders. It all starts at the gut, Deborah.
Absolutely. I hear you on that one. Okay. Sorry?
I would add.
Yeah.
I would just add, one of the things that we also talk about in the book is, kids are exposed now to a lot of things. There aren't just food toxicants. There are a lot of chemical toxicants that they're getting from their environment, endocrine disruption and other things as well. But really, when you think about the fact that kids are eating 3 or up to 5, 6 times a day, it's a shocking realization to know that really medicine pays very little attention to food as the primary source and conduit for disorders. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we focus in on the food in the book, and really not just on food as a nutritional source, but food as a source of toxicants. And that's why, we end up talking about what has changed in the nature of our food systems in the past, 2 decades. And genetic modification seems to be one of the key pieces of the story here.
Right. And I really like that you guys have included this in the book, because I've read, there's a lot of books that are out there at the moment on gut health and approaching the gut in order to help improve health, and wonderful books and great information, but not a lot of them have really gone after this issue of the toxicants that are in and on our food. And it's such a key piece of information. So I'd love to chat a little bit about that if we could, and talk about, what you mean by industrialized food, and a little bit more about the genetic modification of food, and what that means for our health.
Sure. The genetic modification process really got launched fully in the U.S. in around 1996. And we've been eating genetically modified food for over 20 years. And so it was designed to create a food that when sprayed with an herbicide, it wouldn't die. Mm-hmm. So seeds, crop commodities such as soy and canola, and corn, those are the main ones, but there are many, many foods that are now genetically modified, were designed so that when you spray them with an herbicide such as Roundup, with the main ingredient being glyphosate, that the plant doesn't die. So that was the thinking behind it. The only reason why genetic modification was brought was for that specific reason, so that plants could be sprayed without dying, not to feed the world, not to reduce hunger, not to use less water, because actually the process requires more water. And so that's one form of genetic modification. But what we have found is that this process is not held to be true. We have not fed the world's hungry. We've not decreased the use of water, and we've used actually more pesticides because of weed resistance. So here in the U.S., 75% of weeds are now resistant to one of the main agrochemicals made by Monsanto, Roundup. And so newer forms of genetic modification called stacking of genes, more toxic chemicals, have since been introduced. So that's kind of a brief overview of where we're now. And Vincanne can enhance on that topic. If you want more information as well, we can switch this off and on for you, Deborah.
Sure. So let me just ask a quick question related to what you've said so far about the genetic modification. Is there data out there that shows us that we're told that as a society, we're told, and I come from a farming background, so we used these products on the farm all the time, and they did hugely increase yield. As I understand it, that's starting to change somewhat, but they increased yield. So there was this sense, at least on the part of the farmer who's producing the food, that they were increasing yield and therefore potentially helping to feed the world. But we are starting to hear now that that's not really the case. Is there hardcore data that's showing that this food, this increase in yield, has not gone to that purpose?
So, yeah, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there is definitely, it's important to know, I like to tell people, because, it's important to know that there's a history here, and that the reason one argument about the reason that these foods were developed is that they were trying to avoid using even worse chemicals like DDT in the post-war era. And so the development of genetic modification was initially, at least on the part of the researchers at Monsanto, which is the main site for the development of genetically modified foods. If you read their stories and their histories, it's very clear they were really trying to develop crops that would be able to be used with pesticides that were harmless to humans. Originally, it was thought that Roundup, with the active ingredient glyphosate, would be harmless to humans. Of course, we now know that the operational pathway for killing plants does have an impact on human microbes in the gut. And this is new information. So, and then there's also the second most common type of genetic modification was the use of something called BT, which is an insecticide. And this really did reduce the need for things like DDT. It also, in theory, reduced the need for use of pesticides on crops that had this quality. And that's because it turned the whole plant into a pesticide.
Right.
That if certain insects ate any part of the plant, it would kill them. And initially, again, they thought, well, this doesn't really affect humans because it only gets activated in the gut of a high pH gut of an insect. But we know now that protein that is used, that is the killer protein, is already activated in most of the crops where it's inserted. And so there are all these questions now about, one, has it really been useful for farming? I think the jury's really very much out on the fact that this has not necessarily been a boon anymore. It was initially, it's not anymore. It costs so much to produce the fertilizers and to buy the fertilizers you need for the fields. It costs so much to produce the seeds and the pesticides that go with them. There's weed resistance, insect resistance to all of these products, so now the cost of growing foods this way has gotten very high, on top of the fact that we now have to use even stronger chemicals to grow these crops, which are known toxicants to humans. So, and there is one of the reports that came out lately from the National Academies of Science, Technology, and Medicine actually argued the fact that it is actually costing farmers more now. And we've never asked the question, well, what would it mean to not subsidize those kinds of farmers and subsidize organic instead? We have plenty of evidence that organic food produces more nutritious food, it has less toxic chemicals, and if the distribution problem is the main problem, we could figure that out. So yeah, that's sort of this. I think that the writing is on the wall for a lot of these products. Unfortunately, a lot of the companies that make these products are really locked into a model, a productivity model and a fiscal model that requires them to just keep using the same technologies over and over again.
And just to also your point, Deborah, in terms of yield, the first few yields when you switch to genetically modified seed do increase the yield. And that's actually shown, but then afterwards the yield goes down. I based those readings on a plant biologist named Don Huber, who's published over 300 papers on the use of glyphosate in crop yield. I am not an expert on this, but I have read those who are. The other person who you can read about who really speaks to yield and how initially it went up and then down, as you reported on your own family farm, is a retired USDA biologist named Robert Kramer. And he reported that, yes, crops initially yield goes up and then goes down. But what he also reports is after he left the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA, that these seeds don't germinate. So farmers have to reply the seed every year. Yes. And that seeds that do come out in the following years are less healthy, require more nutritive support to get the seeds to germinate, as well as the application of more toxic chemicals such as fungicides, which also have their own health risk. So yes, but no. And then when you actually look at, and we can dig into this if you like, Deborah, what glyphosate actually does in both plants and animals. Remember, there's no human studies on glyphosate, by the way. Yes. All we base it on plants and animals. Then we can get into what actually happens to soil, to plants, and to animals who are exposed to glyphosate, both at high levels and extremely ultra low levels. The findings are quite shocking.
Yes, they are, and I was really interested to dive into that, in reading your book, and I'm glad, that we, in talking about this here, that we address this issue, because I know that people listening, as I'm sure that as you've gone through the process of writing the book and talking to people, that there is some resistance to this idea, and so I like to kind of get that out of the way, ask that question so that we can answer it for the people who are listening and might just have that niggling doubt in the back of their mind. So I appreciate you addressing that question, and I think being from where I am in the world, Calgary, Alberta, Canada, it's a large farming community, and so I have listeners from all over the world, but I have people who are listening to me locally, and I hope that they can hear this message and take it on and not have to just reject it out of hand, to see that there is real scientific evidence to say that A, these things are harmful to our health, and B, that they are probably costing us more than they need to as farmers. So thank you for taking the time to answer that a little bit more thoroughly for me.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. So go ahead.
I could add more to that about this large resistance to recognizing the sciences that are showing harms from genetically modified foods also. I mean, there are so many constituencies. I mean, there's so many things going on here, and we don't go into this hugely in the book, but it's definitely a small part of the book that, some of the evidence that was produced about the harms of GM foods was actually suppressed and attacked. That's one reason people don't believe it, because there's been this concerted effort to conceal and hide that information, even on the part of the companies that were making these. And even with the case of the very first genetically modified food, the Flavor Saver tomato, if you really dig into the history of that from the authors of that have been writing about it, the scientists who were involved, but also other people who've written about it afterward, it's very clear that a lot of the decisions about allowing these foods to get into the food supply were made for political reasons and not for scientific reasons. So the evidence was there. It just wasn't focused on. Mm-hmm. And then there are other reasons that have to do with people in the scientific world being very reluctant to come out against anything that come out against GMOs in any way at all. And that's largely because I think a lot of biomedical research it uses genetic modification techniques for things that are very useful. And we do say in the book, we're not against genetic modification techniques for everything. In fact, in the medical sciences and biomedical research worlds, these techniques are very useful. However, before any product can be given to a human that's been genetically modified, it goes through rigorous testing on human subjects in those worlds. In the world of food, genetically modified foods were ushered in under the assumption that they were generally recognized as safe. They were just like other foods, therefore didn't need that kind of regulation. Mm-hmm. And so we've been eating it without really knowing what it's doing to our bodies for many years. And the evidence from the animal studies that is out there is plentiful. You just have to look for it. You just have to read it carefully. And then you have to turn down the volume on the massive media campaigns that attack those reports.
Yes. That is a big part of it, because there's huge money that's getting poured into attacking those reports, right?
Yeah.
Monsanto makes a huge profit. I think in 2016 they made over $11.3 billion in profit. So we're looking at, an industry that is just flushed. And, they have massive PR campaign, which is slick and glossy for farmers that get their brochures. I've seen their brochures. I started believing it after a while, looking at their beautiful brochures and the beautiful crops farmers will produce. Mm-hmm. So also for those scientists, researchers, educators, academics that come out against these foods, they're